You can actually go to the full thing out here. Getting closer. Hey, now this is more now. And I'm looking at this. So I think no, so have my fingers there. No, it's not. Would be excited.
Every time I'm gonna do it, and then my other husband, like, surprise, you have a movie.
What? Tatum mixed in the wine and all the soul.
It's too Sunday.
Right?
I guess we're not
doing the application. Oh, maybe we're just. Oh.
We figured this out.
Which one?
Wag the dog is what I want.
Is that either like wag the dog or
The media.
Oh,
Yeah. And you want one.
I want
I was waiting for you to say it was shorter. I don't know.
All right, good morning, let's get rolling. This is a smaller class size than the morning class for this and more people, so good work. Happy Friday and welcome. So as we get started today, just a quick recap. Last class, we went over cultivation theory. Cultivation theory discusses the significance of media in shaping people's perceptions, their attitudes, their ways of thinking about the world. We looked at some examples, for example, in crime shows where people oftentimes view events and view reality as reflective of the distorted representations we might see through media. We also had Jack and Luke present and share some of the ways that cultivation theory is not just about television, but it can be applied through the use of social media, thinking about things such as Instagram, and also looking at applications, things such as games and other media, and ongoing debate about its relationship to violence. In cultivation theory, there's a concept here known as the mean world theory or mean world paradigm that suggests that the world is this bad, scary place. Again, if it bleeds, it leads, portraying sort of the most negative perceptions of the world as a way of these news outlets getting attention and interest. So cultivation theory is suggesting that by media doing this, our own understanding of the world is distorted as a result. Today, we're getting to cultural studies. This is a fun one. It's a very broad theory that covers a very wide range of human experiences. We'll be looking at kind of a fun example here of its application and usage. We'll also have Joey, who will be giving a discussion leading presentation going over this as well. Doesn't look like I'm seeing Joey here at the moment. Joe submitted a presentation, so hopefully Joey shows up in a bit. So as we're potentially waiting for Joey and getting started, one thing to think about here are the options that are available for you for your second application paper. We did some brainstorming recently talking about some of the options for theories that you could use, but I'm going to dedicate some time for you to think about this even more. For instance, considering some possible artifacts relative to the kinds of theories that we've been talking about so far in the quarter. For example, one type of thing you can focus on is application paper number 2. You have options here of some of the rhetoric-oriented theories. So for example, rhetoric, dramatism, narrative paradigm, which would be really good if you're looking at some type of public speech or address. We've also looked at a number of interpersonal theories that might be relevant for you to use as well. For instance, talking about relational dialectics, and you can look at that in the context of film, television, or other kinds of relationships. If you find yourself interested in studying kind of organizations, management, advertising, and so on, you could apply something such as organizational culture theory or media ecology theory to examine some of these things too. And then we also talked about some of the major kind of mass media theories as it relates perhaps to historical events and other significant things, using theories, again, such as cultivation theory, to get into some of those in greater detail. So what I'd like you to do here is to take some time on your own. So application paper number 2 is due a week from Sunday, and then there'll be a quick turnaround for me in giving you feedback so that you can angle towards the final paper. That's the revision of one of the 2. So given that, and given that you have just over a week to work on your second application paper, especially since we head into Memorial Day next week, figure out a timeline for yourself. So for instance, work backwards from the deadline of June 4th and say, you know, maybe by next Wednesday, I'm going to create an outline. Maybe by next Friday, I'm going to create a full draft. You're also welcome again to send me a rough draft or outline ahead of time for my feedback and comments, which you don't have to do, or meet with me in office hours or send me some possible ideas if you're deciding or trying to figure out if something might work for this assignment. And have you selected a theory? If not, what might be some of the theories that you're thinking about for this paper? Again, the theories we're talking about this week are good candidates. You're welcome to jump ahead to a theory from next week, although you're getting kind of close to the end by that point. And then what is an artifact, a possible artifact that you're considering for this paper? Again, this doesn't lock you in, but you should be at a point now where you're really starting to think about how to develop this project with possible artifacts. So I'll give you some time to work on and to develop this, and then I'll ask you to share some of your ideas in groups. if you feel good about what you've come up with so far, I'd encourage you to find a partnership or small group to exchange just some of your ideas, possible theories, and artifacts here.
Just for its very. I either promise it, promise me partner, I wanted to send it.
The only thing that might change is that I forget what it was. For financial presentation. That's the only thing that I'm actually doing. Probably that I haven't looked into it yet. Because that's tomorrow. I'm thinking about, I actually changed from this. And I was possibly thinking about, either of you read Storm like Architectural Brains? I mean, I didn't read it, I was audiobook. It's very good. The audiobook is amazing. The audiobook is also like 17 hours for the first book. And there's 500 now. It's a little bit longer. But there's a speech one that I can't understand. Anyone, so if you know that like more popular, anytime. Basically, you narrate a lot of there's the vision that coming to that's that things like and so no one causes stuff. And so then
Okay, a couple more minutes, continue thinking about your ideas or working with a partner.
Oh, you are still working on it, right? This is actually a real problem. And so it's just this weird perception of what his target audience was versus what it actually. Because he was actually so out of character and so far into trying to be logical. Appeal to their age. That's not you.
Well, he says.
Right. So let's talk just together as a group again. I wanted to give you a little window to do this since, we'll come back from the long weekend and it'll be Wednesday and we'll be pretty close to that deadline. So I think planning ahead and thinking about next steps will help a lot. So thank you for doing that and starting to develop your ideas. And let's get into cultural studies. So cultural studies, right? This is a very kind of broad theory that covers a lot of aspects of communication. For instance, critical and cultural studies are oftentimes put together as their own kind of area of study. I'm a graduate of the University of Utah, which had a very strong cultural studies and critical cultural orientation. And I approach a lot of my work from a critical perspective. So there's kind of a lot of crossover in my own interest that relates to this theory. So cultural studies, if we think about this broadly, right, we've discussed culture as the kind of traditions, behaviors, practices, that are shared by a group of people that are oftentimes passed down generationally, right? It's not just about race and ethnicity or nationality, but it covers a whole range of identity and difference. But this idea here is that culture is in many ways informed by powerful and dominant groups. We talked about this when we talked about various theories of media, of how sort of media framing is a big aspect of our lives, right? We think about the use of popular media, what is circulating, what kind of messages are popular and being circulated through mass media outlets. In many ways, right, the study of media is in many ways concerned with how these broader ideologies and perspectives are being represented. For example, it's understanding the politics of identity, right? How is identity being represented? Whose identity is being represented, and so on. We see a lot of discussions about this with regard to race, right? So, for instance, recent media such as the live action Little Mermaid remake, Queen Charlotte, right? Those are depicting kind of a more racially diverse cast than perhaps the origin of these forms of media. We also think about, again, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and other aspects of identity and how those identities might be represented or depicted, right? For instance, as I mentioned last class, the history of kind of LGBTQ representation on television has oftentimes been marked by kind of very derogatory and stereotypical depictions, but we've seen changes like over time, right? You might look to some markers, for instance, television series like Will and Grace, but moving more into more contemporary era where there's been a greater kind of diversity of representation present in media too. So this takes a critical tradition of mass media in terms of its context, looking at larger messages directed to the public. Again, sometimes, right, when we think about cultural studies, we think, oh, these are people who are just like studying movies or studying TV shows. Sounds fun, sounds like recreation, but they're doing so in the context of understanding how the broader messages and themes of said media are informing our sense of reality and attitudes, right? If we think again about cultivation theory, contact theory, there are a lot of elements in which what we see and how we see it depicts our attitudes and understanding of various issues. For example, right, the TV show Star Trek was famous for depicting the first kind of interracial kiss on television, right? And those kinds of depictions play a major role in how we think about issues like race and integration in the context of areas of segregation. I want to kind of show an interesting example here in a bit. There's a famous and somewhat controversial Slovenian philosopher known as Slavoj Žižek. He's very well known for kind of cultural studies and analyzing mediated text. And he actually did an analysis of this 1980s film called They Live. The premise of this film is that the main character basically finds this pair of glasses, and when he puts on this pair of glasses, he discovers that there are aliens who are masquerading as humans. And also when he looks at things like advertisement, it depicts like the real message of the advertisement rather than the kind of what you see without the glasses on. So this is kind of used as a metaphor to describe ideology according to Žižek's analysis. So we'll get into that in just a little bit. So cultural studies comes from Stuart Hall. You might be familiar with Stuart's work. Stuart Hall was born in Jamaica and kind of brought about a plethora of experiences in cultural studies, right? Particularly understanding kind of his own experience and how that shaped understanding of culture. One other thing that Hall is very, very well known for is ways of differentiating and defining different cultures, right? Not defining in terms of better or worse, but suggesting some measures of cultural difference, individualistic versus collectivist, low and high power distance, and so on, right? So cultural studies is definitely not limited to communication. Cultural studies is used a lot in things like psychology, anthropology, sociology, in a variety of other fields outside of the study of communication, but is in many ways embraced and used within communication studies as well. So cultural studies, right? One of the key ideas here is that culture, as we think about it, is this very pervasive element that impacts our human behavior, right? What does it mean to perform, to engage, to express yourself, be it through gender, be it through membership in groups and so forth, right? You might be familiar when we think about with the rhetoric and communication of women's liberation, right? And what's known kind of as the second wave feminism. Second wave was very much associated with this kind of focus on things such as, access to resources, access to paid time off, access to the structural elements that women were encountering. We associate the first wave with suffrage. We associate the third, arguably fourth, waves more with the international and intercultural elements. The personal is political is a phrase that emerged in many ways in this kind of second wave, talking about the idea that issues that impact somebody's own body, their physicality, their identity, don't exist in isolation. They exist in relationship to culture, social, and political issues. Again, I'm sure you can see a lot of these types of debates are continuing to rage on. So cultural studies have a root in Marxist perspective, right? Understanding from this perspective some of the ways in which media possesses control from kind of elite, including corporate groups. This is something similar to theories we've discussed before when we talked about things like agenda setting theory, right? No matter how you slice it, media groups have a lot of power. They have a lot of control in dictating, circulating, and conveying and communicating a particular message. Right. For example, I was reading an article the other day that was talking about how presidential candidates are oftentimes kind of portrayed and represented via media, oftentimes in a very limited way. Right. So, for example, former President Bush was depicted as, not very bright. Al Gore was depicted as this kind of detached intellectual type. We're seeing kind of similar sort of pigeonholing and stereotypes for presidential candidates. There's been a lot of discussion surrounding candidates such as Scott and DeSantis and how they're depicted through media, right? So a lot of discussion here about how media control can impact cultural attitudes. The Frankfurt School of Philosophy is in many ways concerned with the idea that media cares more about making money than providing accurate information. Again, if we think back to It Bleeds, It Leads, it's more attractive to depict violent issues that are going to get people's attention than it is to necessarily depict accurate information. And then there's also what's known as a more neo-Marxist perspective that has a more limited embrace of some of these ideas that are taking into account the fact that other aspects of cultural and identity are existing in relationship to sort of class as well. Right. So again, each of these theories in the class brings about a set of assumptions. We can agree, we can disagree, but I think it's useful to lay out what assumptions and beliefs are guiding each individual theory and how this theory is attempting to explain its approach to an issue. So again, I've been using kind of the language talking about glasses a lot, and we'll literally see that in just a little bit. We think about ideology, right? Ideology is a framework that's used to make sense of meaning. Again, it's kind of giving a broader assessment of the world, making sense of ideas together, right? The pair of glasses that we wear. Does everything happen for a reason? Does something like karma exist? Right? Those are ideas that ideology is kind of guiding us to believe. Culture wars, right? This suggests, and again, we've seen this a lot, including in recent years, about the struggle over meaning, identity, and existence, right? What does it mean to be X identity or X population? What does it mean to find yourself supported within sort of legal protections and so on? We see a lot of discussion and debate over this, right? A lot of kind of backlash against media that might depict content in a more kind of socially progressive way, or push back against particular representations of characters and so on in film. Meaning, of course, is what we're getting out of, taking away from the experience. Oftentimes media is shaping, right, what kind of meaning or message we're deriving from the particular situation or context, right? So this is not necessarily explicitly stated, right? But sometimes, right, the depiction of media messages is, trying to convey a perspective and way of thinking about things, right? So for instance, I watched the most recent Shazam movie last night, and there's a big emphasis on the kind of chosen family, adoptive family, and, those types of messages that we see in film depicted a lot. So we also have this idea of hegemony, which we might think about in international relations as the level of kind of power, influence, and control that countries exert over one another. In this context, we're referring to the dominance or control that might be exhibited against another group, and some of the ways that this kind of master group narrative is manifesting in media and understandings of reality. There's also the idea of false consciousness. That is, we come in with a set of assumptions, and we're not fully aware of some of the ways that our own beliefs and free will are kind of being controlled via media outlets. And then language is referring to how we use symbols, of course, to communicate and convey reality. So again, this is taking a very critical approach, and this is not necessarily, right, an approach that is coming in with a specific political or social goal as much as it is offering skepticism and criticism of the messages that we're exposed to day to day. A few other ideas here related to cultural studies and defining cultural studies. One of them is dealing with the idea of the theater of struggle, the idea that we have a variety of different ideologies and perspectives that compete with one another in various states of conflict, right? So we have a sort of competition over meaning and how we create meaning. One way I like to think about this, right, is Montana became the first US state to ban TikTok, and they did so by basically fining the company if they, for users in the state, have that listed in the App Store. So there's been a lot of kind of debate and even a lawsuit that's happening over that right now. An example here of theater of struggle and how we're understanding and using media. Counter hegemony is using hegemonic behaviors to change people's lives, recognizing that people are these kind of active participants. So you might be familiar, right, with Audre Lorde's discussion about master's tools to break the master's house, right? And the idea here being that a counter hegemonic perspective is existing in opposition to that primary major perspective, offering sort of this form of media and content that goes against the sort of mainstream assumptions. And we've also talked about some of the communication models in the class, but there's the idea that we're receiving and comparing messages through the process of decoding. So according to how we receive messages, right, cultural studies takes on a few different approaches, right? So the dominant position is a code that essentially allows a message to receive its intended meaning. We're taking in that message oftentimes without any sort of critical approach or way of thinking, right? So for example, right, we watch a movie and we kind of become accustomed to and supportive of the broader message, or we read news headlines and we see kind of the violence that's happening and we think, oh, okay. A negotiated position, right, is accepting the dominant ideology, but is allowing some wiggle room and pushback to say, okay, I see these headlines, they're depicting a lot of violence. I know that they like to do that, but I also think that the things that they're sharing are accurate. An oppositional position is offering an alternate code. One way of thinking about this is the idea of reading against the grain, right? So, you're not reading or taking in a message as gospel. In fact, you might strongly disagree with the message and you're explaining your reasons for disagreeing that message. I disagree with the way in which media is depicting this topic. My understanding is very different. Here's why, right? So the idea here is that our way that we're receiving and making sense of a message is going to differ according to cultural studies. So cultural studies, right, it's taking on a very interpretive and qualitative approach to understand human experience. Just as a byproduct of taking on that approach, right, its methods are going to be kind of limited. So you might be familiar, there is a cultural theorist known as Guattari Spivak, who kind of writes about the experiences of the caste system in India and the experiences of marginalized populations. Famously posed the question, can the subaltern speak? That is, if a population is not only marginalized in terms of things like geographical location and power, but also in terms of things like educational opportunities, right? That is a really major challenge because it assumes that marginalized populations have the resources and ability to speak out when they might be structurally excluded from the resources to do so, right? So cultural studies is suggesting our ability to speak and engage oppositionally when the populations we're studying and experiences we're reporting on, there might not be the resources to do so. And cultural studies is a very broad theory, right? If you're looking at critically assessing and making sense of media, cultural studies is a good approach as a theory for an application paper, but it is taking on a lot. And within that, you kind of have to hone it down to a particular area. right? A lot of research and communication that takes on cultural studies, but there could be a bit more depth and explanation about how it's doing that. So since Joey was able to come in and join us, we will have Joey's presentation here. And after that, we'll continue to discuss an example here of cultural studies. All right. So you are welcome to click or use the arrow keys through. I'm just going to take a minute to get my timer set, and then I'll be all ready for you. All right, are you ready?
All right, I chose the article Media Information Communication Technologies and Youth Literacies in Cultural Studies Perspective by Donna E. Elberman. The key ideas of this article is youth use media as a way to communicate with their peers, be it social media, email, texts, you name it. Being a participant in the 21st century means to be literate in media and ICTs, which is, as in the title, is information communication technologies. Students tend to know more about media than even their teachers. I'm sure you guys can all recall back to lower grades where you would be sitting there just going crazy as your teacher's trying to figure out how to full screen a YouTube video. New media technologies are fundamentally and irreversibly affecting how ideas get represented in texts and communication. Developing youth's critical awareness teaches students that all texts, including textbooks, routinely promote or silence particular views, and audiences tend to be easily duped by media establishments that are considered in power. This is seen in how print and non-print textual images reflect certain ideologies that can be seen as oppressive to certain groups of people, women and people of color specifically, in order to keep the status quo and furthering the goals of those in power. I'm sure you guys have taken a history course or something, and there's been new information that you've never heard before, and it kind of changes your whole perspective on history. For the connection to the theory, a key term here is hypertext, which, if you don't know what a hypertext is, if you've ever copied a link to a website, the HTTPS is considered a hypertext. So is www. In connecting to the theory, hypertext may be seen as a privilege in ways that traditional ways to read is not, as it can give you more access compared to other people. Hypertext may also create new opportunities for readers that would be unavailable to them in standardized print. Again, there's much more information on the World Wide Web than there is in even our textbook for this class. There's a focus on the educational and physical context in society. It has been seen since the 1940s that media production dominates audience consumption, and media literacy may be seen as a special form of reading and writing, one that focuses on the message that mass media sends. Some things that they gained from this article is some educators may argue that the relevance of using online network environments are questionable or marginal at best. Other educators are concerned that if this is ignored, then they may fail to benefit from insights that could be gained from tapping into this youth culture of the internet and such. Any attempt by educators to co-opt youth culture would largely be rejected by those within culture itself. There must be a compromise or negotiation, which would be one in which a variety of both print and digital mediated environments are part of the curriculum. So it can't just be one or the other. It has to be a combination of the two. There's promising evidence among second language readers that there is an effectiveness of literacy instruction that integrates hypermedia. And there's noticeable evidence that adolescents are making valuable reading and writing connections in their bid to communicate in a computer-dominated world. And here's my references.
All right. Thank you so much, Joey. I think in kind of getting into the application and utility of cultural studies, it's really useful for us to, again, think about new technologies and ways that that's changing the landscape. You might think cultural studies is super broad and it's covering just about everything. But if we're thinking about kind of analyzing and utilizing cultural studies, what we're thinking about here is how media of various forms is creating culture, right? So media is in that way generative. We might think about the formation of online communities. Maybe you're part of a Twitch stream, or you're part of some type of Discord server or subreddit that's particularly relevant to lived experiences. That's very much tied to development of culture and cultural identity. I was hearing the other day that there's actually a Gen Z trend that is funny, and it kind of makes sense. Is more Gen Z folks are saying, and I guess it's trending on social media, that when they're highly stressed, they will be more inclined to speak with a British accent. So I thought that was kind of fun. And again, a way in which culture identity might be developed over time. Various practices, ways of paving circulation of content such as memes, as we're seeing in these social spaces, is something that cultural studies is in many ways getting at. How are these messages being developed? Who do these messages benefit? Who do these messages represent? So how do we both develop culture via media, and how do we see the culture from media impacting us? Is in many ways what this theory is concerned with. So I want to share a video clip that is, again, the Slovenian philosopher Zizek, who is analyzing They Live and using this as a way of basically describing and outlining cultural studies and the study of ideology as it occurs in media. And I thought this was a good kind of way of helping to visualize and understand what cultural studies does and what it's concerned with. And I have full screen on, so no worries.
You a choice. How to put on these glasses. Let's start eating that trash. I already am eating from the trash can all the time. The name of this trash can is ideology. The material force of ideology makes me not see what I'm effectively eating. It's not only our reality which enslaves us. The tragedy of our predicament when we are within ideology is that when we think that we escape it into our dreams, at that point we are within ideology. They Live from 1988 is definitely one of the forgotten masterpieces of the Hollywood left. It tells the story of John Nada. Nada, of course, in Spanish means nothing, a pure subject, deprived of all substantial content, a homeless worker in LA who, drifting around, one day enters into an abandoned church and finds there a strange box full of sunglasses. When he put one of them on, walking along the LA streets, he discovers something weird. That these glasses function like critique of ideology glasses. They allow you to see the real message beneath all the propaganda, publicity, glitz, posters, and so on. You see a large publicity board telling you have your holiday of a lifetime, and when you put the glasses on, you see just on the white background a gray inscription. We live, so we are told, in a post-ideological society. We are interpolated, that is to say, addressed by social authority, as subjects who should do their duty. Subjects of pleasures. Realize your true potential, yourself, the glass is on. Dictatorship in democracy is the invisible order which sustains your apparent freedom. Explanation for the existence of this strange ideology glasses is the standard story of the invasion of the body snatchers. Humanity is already under the control of aliens.
Hey, buddy. Gonna pay for that or what? Look, buddy, I don't know how to make. Either pay for it or put it back.
To our common sense. We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be classes which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite, like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are. This precisely, and here the pessimism of the film of David is well justified. This precisely is the ultimate illusion. Ideology is not simply imposed on ourselves. Ideology is our spontaneous relationship to our social world, how we perceive its meaning, and so on and so on. We, in a way, enjoy our ideology. To step out of ideology, it hurts. It's a painful experience. You must force yourself to do it. This is rendered in a wonderful way with a further scene in the film where John Nada tries to force his best friend from Armitage to also put the glasses on. I don't want to fight you. Come on. I don't want to fight you. Stop it. No. And it's the weirdest scene in the film. The film takes 8-9 minutes. It may appear irrational because why does this guy reject so violently to put the glasses on? And if he is well aware that spontaneously he lives in a lie, that the glasses will make him see the truth, but that this truth can be painful, can shatter many of your illusions.
So, again, kind of an analysis of this film and the ways in which this kind of metaphor of the glasses, right? You put on the glasses, you see these messages like the dollar bills are your God, and this encounter with the friend who doesn't want to kind of see the world as it might be, not as it's sort of distorted and represented. I think as an example here again of cultural studies, right? Cultural studies is putting on the glasses. You're looking at something like an advertisement. You're saying, what are the broader messages and assumptions that this advertisement is trying to convey? What does it want us to believe, do, think, and so on? And in many ways, if we think again about this kind of third person or bystander effect, we oftentimes don't think that we're convinced by or kind of put into this role of accepting media rather than, we oftentimes are assuming that we are more critical and are thinking than we actually are through media. So a good example here of how cultural studies can be thought about as this kind of critical assessment of the broader themes, ideology, and perspective that is conveyed through our daily life. So we'll get out a little early today. I'd say enjoy the sun, but there's been some rain and stuff going on today. So take some time, maybe think about over the long weekend, your second application paper, what you want that to look like. We talked about cultural studies today and how it can be used to make sense of studying communication artifacts and broader assumptions about the world. We will not be meeting on Monday for Memorial Day, but we will be meeting next Wednesday to talk about muted group theory. So please pass forward or email your attendance assignment today if you haven't done so already. Have a great weekend. Enjoy any travels you're doing for the long weekend, and see you on Wednesday.